The year is 1221. The dust of Central Asia hangs thick in the air as Genghis Khan's army storms through the Persian city of Nishapur. The Mongols have already slaughtered tens of thousands of men, but what awaits the women is far more horrifying. Imagine your husband, your brothers, your sons, all executed before your eyes. Then a chilling silence falls. The Mongols drag the women of the city into the open square. Enemy wives are lined up like cattle, their fate not to die quickly, but to serve as tools of punishment. Some will be forced into slavery, handed to warriors as living spoils of war. Others will be subjected to brutal lessons, devised by Genghis Khan himself. A message carved into flesh and bone: defy the great Khan, and even your women will bear the torment of your rebellion. These punishments were not random acts of cruelty. They were strategies designed to shatter entire civilizations through fear. From being buried alive with their dead husbands, to being used as human shields in battle, to grotesque public humiliations, the wives of Genghis Khan's enemies endured terrors so unimaginable that even centuries later, chroniclers wrote of them with trembling hands. But how much of this was cold calculation, and how much was the savage wrath of a conqueror who believed himself chosen by the eternal blue sky? Before we unravel this dark story of vengeance and power, welcome to Royal Conspiracies, the channel where we dive into the hidden, dramatic, and brutal truths of history's most powerful rulers. If you crave stories that are shocking, suspenseful, and real, make sure you subscribe right now, hit the like button, and share this documentary with others who dare to uncover the blood-soaked secrets of the past. Now, let us step into the ruthless world of Genghis Khan and the terrifying punishments he dealt to enemy wives. The city of Nishapur was one of Persia's great jewels. Rich with scholars, poets, and craftsmen, it stood as a proud symbol of resistance against Mongol invasion. But when its governor killed Genghis Khan's beloved son-in-law, Takuchur, in 1221, the Khan's fury became unstoppable. The response was swift and merciless. Genghis ordered his troops, led by his daughter Khotan, the widow of Takuchur, to annihilate Nishapur as revenge. Chroniclers like Giovanni wrote that over 1.7 million people were massacred. Though modern historians suggest a lower number, it was still one of the most horrifying slaughters in medieval history. Yet what often goes unspoken is what happened to the women. After the mass killings of men, thousands of wives and daughters were captured alive. For them, death might have been a mercy. The Mongols saw conquered women not merely as captives, but as political instruments. Khotan herself reportedly demanded that the wives of Nishapur's nobles be made examples of, dragged into the ruins of their homes, stripped of honor, and forced into servitude. Many were divided among soldiers, their identities erased, their fates bound to the whims of Mongol riders who saw them as trophies of vengeance. But Genghis Khan's punishments were not limited to enslavement. In some cases, captured wives were forced to watch their children executed, ensuring that their bloodlines were erased along with their husbands. Others were buried alive alongside their slain spouses, as if to cement the idea that no legacy could survive rebellion against the Khan. Witnesses recorded the chilling silence that followed these acts. Nishapur was left not just destroyed, it was sterilized, its memory scorched into history as a warning. And it was the wives, the women who carried the future of families, who bore the brunt of this cruelty. To Genghis Khan, this was not madness. It was calculated terror. He understood that the humiliation and destruction of enemy wives broke not only individuals, but entire societies. It struck at the very heart of lineage, honor, and continuity. And Nishapur was just the beginning. For across Central Asia, the great Khan would devise new punishments for the wives of his enemies, each more terrifying than the last. While Nishapur lay in ashes, another tragedy unfolded in the Afghan city of Bamiyan. Unlike Nishapur, Bamiyan was a fortress town hidden among steep mountains, a natural stronghold that dared to resist the Mongols. But resistance against Genghis Khan always came with a price. During the siege, the defenders fought fiercely, and in the chaos, Genghis Khan's grandson, beloved and young, was struck down and killed. The Khan's rage, already legendary, now reached terrifying heights. Bamiyan was doomed. But what makes this event particularly chilling is how Genghis turned the city's women into weapons. Historical accounts suggest that when Mongol soldiers finally broke through the gates, wives and daughters of the defenders were rounded up. Instead of killing them outright, many were driven to the front lines, forced to march before the Mongol cavalry as human shields. Imagine the scene, mothers screaming, children clinging to them as arrows rained from their own city walls. Husbands and fathers, still fighting inside, faced an impossible choice: continue resisting and strike down their own wives, or surrender and hope for mercy that would never come. The tactic worked. Bamiyan's defenses crumbled as morale shattered. Soldiers watched helplessly as their loved ones were paraded in front of them, used as pawns in a game of fear. It was a cruel reminder that Genghis Khan understood not only how to wield armies, but how to weaponize human emotion itself. When Bamiyan finally fell, the punishment was absolute. The city was razed to the ground, its population slaughtered. But the fate of the wives left a lasting scar. Some were killed outright, others enslaved, and some disappeared into the vast camps of the Mongol horde, never to see their homeland again. For the Khan, this was not just about vengeance, it was about strategy. By turning wives into shields, he demonstrated to the world that no one, not even women, was safe from his wrath. And word of this cruelty spread across Asia like wildfire, breaking the spirit of countless other cities before a single Mongol arrow was fired. Bamiyan became a warning. To resist the Khan meant to risk not only your own death, but the suffering of your wives, your daughters, and your bloodline itself. Among the Mongols, death was not always the end of suffering. For the wives of Genghis Khan's enemies, it could mean something far worse: being forced to follow their husbands into the grave, even if still alive. This brutal practice was recorded in several Mongol campaigns, especially when nobles or high-ranking commanders were captured. Instead of simply executing a defeated ruler, the Mongols sometimes buried his wife alive beside him. To Genghis Khan, this was a symbolic punishment, erasing not just a man's life, but his legacy, his family, and his future in a single stroke. One chilling account speaks of noble wives tied and thrown into open pits alongside their dead husbands. Earth was then shoveled over them, their muffled screams mixing with the sound of collapsing soil. In Mongol culture, burial alive was a fate reserved for traitors or those meant to be erased from memory. By condemning wives in this way, the Khan made a terrifying statement: the dishonor of rebellion would consume not only the guilty man, but every bond he held dear. Imagine the terror of these women, draped in torn silks, jewels still clinging to their hands, staring at the lifeless bodies of their husbands as soil rained down over their faces. There would be no grave of honor, no mourning songs, only silence and darkness. Such punishments also served another purpose: fear. Word of these burials spread faster than the Mongol armies themselves. In city after city, rulers who had once sworn to resist began to hesitate, knowing that their wives, symbols of their house and honor, might share their fate in the most horrifying way possible. The Mongols knew that the collapse of a dynasty was not complete until the women of that dynasty were destroyed, humiliated, or absorbed into Mongol rule. Burials alive were not just cruelty, they were psychological warfare, a way to crush the soul of a people without lifting another sword. And so, as Genghis Khan's empire expanded, the graves of countless noble wives became hidden scars across the deserts and steppes, mute reminders that to defy the Khan was to condemn even the most innocent to a fate worse than death. When the Mongols conquered a city, the battlefield did not end with swords and arrows. For the wives of defeated nobles and warriors, the real nightmare often began after the fighting stopped. Captured women were herded into the center of the ruined city, surrounded by Mongol soldiers on horseback. Here, a cruel spectacle unfolded: the auction block. Wives, once adorned with silks and jewels, were stripped of their dignity and displayed before the warriors who had destroyed their world. To Genghis Khan, this was not merely about rewarding his men, it was about erasing the power of the enemy. By turning wives into prizes, he transformed noble women into living proof of conquest. A general's wife, a prince's widow, even a queen, all could be paraded and given away like cattle. The humiliation was deliberate. Chroniclers tell of wives forced to stand silently as warriors laughed, mocked, and claimed them as spoils. Some were sold into slavery, others forced into marriages with Mongol officers, their past identities erased. For the defeated, it was the ultimate dishonor, seeing the women of their households carried off, powerless, into foreign hands. The auction block also served as a terrifying warning. The sight of noble wives reduced to slaves broke the spirit of many rulers long before a Mongol siege began. Cities that surrendered quickly sometimes begged to spare their women, knowing the fate that awaited them otherwise. But mercy was rare. To the Khan, this was psychological warfare. By destroying not only the men but also the pride of their households, he ensured that resistance carried a price that extended far beyond death. Imagine a queen, once seated on a golden throne, now tied with ropes, standing in the dust while soldiers argued over who would take her. Imagine a noble wife, forced to serve the very men who had slaughtered her family. These images spread across Asia faster than Mongol arrows, burning fear into every city yet to face the horde. For the Mongols, women were both trophies and tools of power. For their enemies, they were the deepest wound of all, a wound that could never heal. After a city fell, the battlefield stank of smoke and blood, but for many wives, the nightmare was only beginning. Survivors were dragged in chains to the vast Mongol encampments, rolling cities of felt tents, horse herds, and warriors who had no pity. Here, enemy wives became living property. Some were handed to soldiers as rewards, while others were forced to serve in silence, cooking, tending horses, or carrying water for the very men who had destroyed their homes. The transformation was brutal. Noble women who once dined in marble halls now slept on the dirt floors of tents, rising at dawn to obey their captors. Some were beaten for disobedience, others branded with scars of humiliation. The Mongols did not simply conquer bodies, they conquered souls. But Genghis Khan also used this cruelty as strategy. By scattering enemy wives among his army, he destroyed dynasties forever. A queen enslaved could no longer raise her children to resist. A noble wife absorbed into Mongol life was erased from her people's memory. The silence of the camps was as devastating as the noise of battle. And yet, even in this silence, terror lingered. Many wives lived with the constant fear of sudden death. If a soldier tired of his captive, she could be abandoned in the wilderness, or worse, executed to make room for new spoils from the next conquest. Imagine the horror, women who once commanded servants now reduced to nameless slaves, carrying buckets of horse milk under the cold Mongol night sky, hearing the laughter of warriors who boasted about how empires had fallen at their feet. For Genghis Khan, these camps were more than temporary prisons, they were symbols of absolute domination. Every enslaved wife was a living reminder to the world. The Khan's power reaches even into the hearts of your homes. The silence of the camps was not peace. It was the echo of a world broken beyond repair. Not every punishment ended in death. For some wives, the torment was public humiliation, staged deliberately to crush the honor of entire families. When Mongol armies captured noble women, they were sometimes dragged into the marketplace of their fallen city. Here, before the surviving townsfolk, the women were stripped of status and dignity. A queen who once ruled from a throne could be forced to kneel in the dust, mocked by soldiers, spat upon by crowds terrified into silence. This was no random cruelty. Genghis Khan understood the cultural weight of honor. In many societies, from Persia to the Rus, women were symbols of family pride. By humiliating wives, he struck deeper than any sword. He turned symbols of nobility into images of helplessness. Chroniclers describe wives paraded through the ruins, forced to serve wine at feasts of their captors, or made to bow before Mongol generals who mocked their fallen husbands. Some were dragged in chains through the very streets where they once commanded respect. The message was clear: defy the Khan, and even your queens will crawl. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who saw their wives degraded felt their courage collapse. Entire dynasties lost face when their women, once protected jewels of the household, were displayed as broken spoils. For the wives themselves, humiliation was a fate worse than death. Stripped of their identity, they became living ghosts, remembered not as noble figures but as cautionary tales. And this humiliation did not fade with time. It was retold, whispered, and spread across nations as living propaganda for the Mongol Empire. Imagine the scene. A princess forced to pour wine for the killers of her family, her hands trembling as laughter echoes around her. Or a proud wife made to bow before soldiers who once cowered at her husband's gates. These were punishments that scarred not only the women, but the very memory of their people. For Genghis Khan, humiliation was as sharp a weapon as his sword. It conquered without blood, and it lingered longer than any battle wound. In 1220, the Mongol army marched on Samarkand, one of the richest cities of Central Asia. Its turquoise domes and bustling bazaars stood as a jewel of Islamic civilization. But when the gates were closed against Genghis Khan, the city sealed its own doom. Samarkand's defenders fought bravely, but Genghis used a terror tactic that turned wives into weapons. Chroniclers describe how the Khan's forces seized the women of captured villages along the way, forcing them to march at the front of the Mongol lines. These wives, terrified and crying, were driven toward the city walls as living shields. From the battlements, Samarkand's soldiers froze. Their arrows and spears now risked striking their own kin. Some hesitated, others lowered their weapons entirely. The wives screamed the names of their families, begging their husbands not to fire. The tactic worked. Samarkand's defenses cracked, not because its walls were weak, but because the spirit of its soldiers broke under the sight of their wives and daughters caught between two deaths. When the gates finally fell, the punishment was merciless. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, and the city was plundered for its wealth. The wives who had been used as shields were dragged back into the Mongol camps, some executed, others enslaved. For them, survival meant living as the spoils of their enemy. The cruelty of Samarkand's siege became a story whispered across Central Asia. It was not just the destruction of a city, it was the shattering of families. Husbands were forced to watch their wives degraded, and wives were forced to beg their husbands for mercy that never came. To Genghis Khan, this was perfect strategy. By weaponizing women, he destroyed both armies and morale in one stroke. It was proof that his conquest was not only physical, it was psychological. He knew that to break a civilization, he had to break its most sacred bonds. The turquoise domes of Samarkand still stood after the siege, but the spirit of its people had been ground to dust. And the memory of wives used as shields burned in the minds of every ruler yet to face the Mongols. In 1221, the wealthy Khwarezmian city of Urgench, modern-day Uzbekistan, stood as one of the greatest strongholds of Central Asia. Its bazaars overflowed with silk and gold, its palaces gleamed under the desert sun. But when it resisted the Mongols, it sealed a fate more brutal than any city before. The siege was long and bloody. The Mongols struggled against Urgench's defenses, but when the walls finally fell, Genghis Khan unleashed a punishment so total that historians still debate the death toll, some claiming hundreds of thousands were slaughtered. And for the wives of Urgench, survival was no salvation. Chronicles describe women dragged into the open squares, where Mongol soldiers divided them as spoils. Noble wives, dressed in finery only hours before, were stripped of their dignity in front of survivors. Some were enslaved, others executed in the ruins of their homes. But what made Urgench unforgettable was the burning of captives alive. Witnesses tell of women tied together and thrown into flames, either as punishment for resistance or as sacrifices to the Mongol thirst for vengeance. The fire consumed not just bodies, but the very spirit of the Khwarezmian dynasty. Imagine the terror, wives clutching each other as smoke filled their lungs, the city's domes glowing red from the inferno. For survivors forced to watch, the message was clear: defy the Khan, and your women will be destroyed in ways too horrific to imagine. The fall of Urgench was not just a military victory. It was psychological devastation. By annihilating the wives and families of his enemies, Genghis Khan erased the possibility of resistance rising again. Without mothers, without wives, without honor, dynasties withered into ashes. Even today, legends of Urgench speak of a city drowned in blood and fire, where the screams of women echoed longer than the clash of steel. Among the most tragic victims of Genghis Khan's wrath were not only nameless wives, but queens themselves. The Khwarezmian Empire had stood proudly against the Mongols, until its collapse in 1221. When Shah Muhammad II fled in terror, abandoning his empire, it was his family, especially the women, who bore the brunt of punishment. Chroniclers describe how the Shah's mother, Turken Khatun, once one of the most powerful queens of Central Asia, was captured along with other royal wives. Once adorned with jewels and guarded by armies, she was now bound in chains, forced to kneel before Mongol generals. For Genghis Khan, this was more than vengeance, it was theater. To humiliate a queen was to destroy the very heart of an empire. Ten Khatun and other noble wives were paraded through conquered lands, their royal dignity stripped away. Some were enslaved, others executed quietly, erased from history. The Khan knew the symbolism. A king could flee and a prince could die, but when queens and noble wives were broken, dynasties could never recover. These women represented continuity, bloodlines, alliances, legitimacy. By dragging them into the dust, he destroyed not just a nation's present, but its future. Imagine the silence of the royal court that once obeyed Turken Khatun. Imagine the whispers of survivors as they watched their queen, once untouchable, reduced to a captive. For the people of the Khwarezm, the humiliation of their queens was a deeper wound than the fall of their walls. Even in death, these punishments lingered. The chronicles speak less of the Shah himself than of the dishonor that fell upon his wives. It was as though history itself remembered the Mongol cruelty through the suffering of women, not the fall of kings. For Genghis Khan, this was victory perfected. Cities could be rebuilt, armies could be raised again, but the shame of queens in chains could never be undone. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire stretched from the Yellow River of China to the Caspian Sea. Millions were dead, cities turned to ash, and dynasties erased. But among the most haunting legacies were the fates of enemy wives. They had been buried alive, burned, enslaved, paraded in chains, mocked, and used as shields of war. To the Khan, they were not simply victims, they were weapons. By breaking wives, he broke nations. By humiliating queens, he destroyed dynasties. By enslaving noblewomen, he erased bloodlines forever. The terror worked. Word of these punishments raced ahead of the Mongol cavalry, often making cities surrender without a single arrow fired. Fathers feared for their daughters, husbands feared for their wives, and rulers feared for their queens. No walls were high enough to protect them, for the Mongols attacked not only cities, but the very bonds of family and honor. And yet, behind the strategy lay something darker: rage, vengeance, and a belief that the Khan was the chosen instrument of heaven. In his eyes, resistance to his rule was not just treason, it was sacrilege. And wives became the canvas on which he carved his warnings to the world. Centuries later, historians still debate the numbers, the details, the exact events. But what remains undisputed is the fear. The punishments of wives under Genghis Khan became legends, stories whispered in Persia, Russia, and beyond. Tales of queens in chains, of noblewomen in flames, of mothers buried alive beside their husbands. These stories remind us of the price of empire, the hidden victims, the forgotten voices. Behind every conquest, there were wives who suffered not because of their own actions, but because of the men they were bound to by marriage. And in that silence, in those broken dynasties and nameless graves, lies the most terrifying truth of all. For Genghis Khan, the conquest of women was the conquest of the future itself.